The lawyer's office smelled like old wood and stale coffee. It was November of 1992, and Jake Henderson was sitting in a leather chair across from a man in a suit who was explaining why inheriting his father's farm wasn't the blessing everyone thought it would be. "So let me make sure I understand this," Jake said slowly. "Dad left me the farm, 240 acres, the house, the equipment, everything. That's correct. But the farm comes with debt. Also correct. Your father had outstanding equipment loans totaling $49,863. The bank has a lien on all the machinery. The loans don't die with him. They transfer to the estate, which means they transfer to you." Jake felt his stomach drop. $50,000. "Approximately, yes. Payments are $947 per month for the next 5 years and 2 months. If you can't make those payments, the bank will repossess the equipment. And without equipment, you can't farm the land." The lawyer slid a stack of papers across the desk. Loan agreements, payment schedules, interest calculations, all signed by Jake's father, Robert Henderson, over the past 8 years. A John Deere 4440 purchased in 1985, a combine bought in 1988, a planter financed in 1990, good equipment, modern machinery, all bought on credit, all still owed on. "I don't have $947 a month," Jake said quietly. "Then you have 3 options. 1, sell the equipment and use the proceeds to pay off the loans. Whatever's left over, you keep. But without equipment, you can't farm. 2, sell the entire farm. Land, equipment, everything. Pay off all the debts. Keep whatever remains. Walk away. 3, find a way to make those payments and keep everything." Jake looked out the window at the grey November sky. His father had died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack in the field. 59 years old. Gone before the ambulance even arrived. And now Jake, who was 25 years old and had been working construction in town for 3 years, had to decide whether to keep his family's farm or let it go. "There's one more thing," the lawyer said. "Your father left you a letter, asked me to give it to you after we discussed the finances." He handed Jake a sealed envelope, Jake's name written in his father's handwriting. Jake opened it with shaking hands. "Jake, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if the lawyer did his job, you now know about the debt I left you. I'm sorry, son. I made choices I thought were right at the time. Bought equipment I thought we needed. Financed it because I didn't have cash and didn't want to wait. I was wrong. The debt became a trap. Every month those payments came due, whether we had a good crop or not, whether prices were up or down, whether equipment broke or ran perfect. The debt didn't care. It just kept demanding its pound of flesh. By the time I realized my mistake, I was in too deep to get out. So I just kept making payments and hoping I'd live long enough to pay it all off before you had to deal with it. I didn't make it. But here's what I want you to know. In the back of the machine shed, there's a tractor I bought before you were born. A 1953 Farmall Super M. I paid $300 cash for it in 1967. Your grandfather and I rebuilt the engine together. I used that tractor to farm this ground for 20 years before I got stupid and started buying new equipment on credit. That Farmall still runs, still works. It's old and slow and nobody would call it impressive, but it doesn't have a payment attached to it. It's free and clear. It's yours. If you decide to keep this farm, forget the fancy equipment. Farm with what's paid for. Use that old Farmall and whatever else you can buy cheap and fix yourself. Live small. Save every dollar. Put every penny you can toward those loan payments. Pay off the debt first. Everything else comes second. And when you're finally free of it, remember what it felt like to be trapped. Remember what it cost me. And never, ever make the same mistake I did. I love you, son. I'm sorry I'm leaving you this mess, but I believe you're strong enough to handle it." Dad Jake sat in that lawyer's office for a long time after he finished reading. Then he looked up at the lawyer. What happens if I keep the financed equipment but can't make the payments? The bank repossesses it, sells it at auction. Whatever they get goes toward what you owe. You're still responsible for any remaining balance, and you lose the equipment. What if I sell the financed equipment myself right now, before I miss any payments? Then you'd use the proceeds to pay down the loans. Anything left over stays as debt you still owe, but at least you'd reduce the principal. Jake nodded slowly. And the old Farmall in the shed? The one that's paid off? That's yours free and clear, no lien on it. It's not mentioned in any loan documents. Okay, Jake said. Here's what I'm going to do. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about getting revenge on a bank or gaming the system or finding some clever loophole. This is a story about a young man who inherited a crushing financial burden and made the hardest choice possible: to accept it, face it, and fight his way out of it one payment at a time. If you want to know how a 25-year-old with no money and an old tractor paid off $50,000 in 5 years, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Jake Henderson did contradicts everything modern farming tells you about equipment and success. Jake's plan was simple, brutal but simple. First, he would sell all the financed equipment: the John Deere 4440, the combine, the planter, everything that had a loan attached to it. Second, he would use every dollar from those sales to pay down the loans as much as possible. Third, whatever debt remained, he would pay off by farming with the only equipment he owned free and clear: his father's 1953 Farmall Super M and whatever cheap implements he could scrounge together. Fourth, he would live on almost nothing. Every dollar he earned beyond basic survival would go straight to those loan payments. The lawyer tried to talk him out of it. Jake, that Farmall is 40 years old. You can't run a modern farming operation with a tractor from the 50s. Watch me. You'll fall behind. You won't be able to cover the acreage. You won't be competitive. I don't need to be competitive. I need to survive. There's a difference. The lawyer shook his head. This is going to be incredibly hard. Harder than losing the farm. No answer. Jake signed the papers to take ownership of the estate. All of it. The land, the house, the equipment, and the $50,000 debt that came with it. Then he went home and started selling. The equipment auction was held on a cold Saturday in December of 1992. Jake stood in the crowd, watching strangers examine his father's tractors. The John Deere 4440 that his dad had been so proud of when he drove it home in 1985. The combine that was supposed to make harvest easier. The planter that was going to help them cover more ground faster. All of it bought on promises. All of it still owed on. All of it about to belong to someone else. The auctioneer started with the 4440. Good tractor, folks. 7 years old, 2,800 hours, maintained well, runs strong. Who'll give me $30,000 to start? Silence. 25,000? A hand went up in the back. I got 25. Now 30. 30. Will you give me 30? Another hand. The bidding climbed slowly. 27. 28. Stopped at $22,000. Sold? 22,000 to bidder 47. Jake felt sick. 22,000. He still owed 31,000 on that tractor, which meant after the sale he'd still owe $9,000 on a tractor he no longer owned. The combine went next. Sold for 16,000. He'd owed 19. That left 3,000 remaining on that note. The planter and other financed implements, a disc, a field cultivator, a grain wagon, sold for a combined $8,000. He'd owed about 12,000 total on those. 4,000 still owed. When all the dust settled, Jake had sold roughly $46,000 worth of equipment. He'd owed just under $50,000. After paying off what he could, he still owed $16,000. $16,000 in debt, and he'd just sold all the equipment he needed to farm. The only thing left in his machine shed was the equipment nobody had wanted to bid on. The old stuff, the stuff his father had owned before the debt spiral started. A 1953 Farmall Super M that barely ran. A 3-bottom plough with rust eating through the moldboards. A grain drill missing half its parts. A hay rake held together with baling wire. Junk, by most standards, scrap metal. The kind of equipment serious farmers got rid of decades ago, but there was one critical difference between that junk and the modern equipment that had just sold. The junk was paid for. After the auction, Jake's uncle Tom pulled him aside. Tom had farmed successfully for 30 years, ran 800 acres with modern equipment, had his operation dialed in. "Jake, I've got to ask you something. What are you going to do?" "Farm." "With what? You just sold everything." "I've still got Dad's old Farmall." Tom looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "That thing's 40 years old. You can't farm 240 acres with a tractor from the 50s. "Why not?" "Because it's too slow. It'll take you 3 times as long to do everything. You'll miss planting windows. You'll fall behind on field work. Jake, you can't compete in modern agriculture with antique equipment." "Uncle Tom, I don't need to compete. I need to survive. There's a difference. You're making a mistake, son. You should sell the land, pay off the debt completely, and start over somewhere else. Maybe get a job in town. This farm isn't worth the struggle." Jake thought about his father's letter, about the warning not to make the same mistakes, about the old Farmall waiting in the shed. "Maybe not," Jake said, "but I'm going to find out." Tom shook his head and walked away, and Jake stood there in the empty auction yard, watching the trucks haul away his father's equipment, wondering if everyone was right and he was making the biggest mistake of his life. His neighbors thought he was crazy. His friends from high school couldn't understand why he didn't just sell everything and walk away. The bank officer who handled the estate settlement told him bluntly that he was making a mistake. But Jake remembered his father's letter, remembered the part about being trapped by payments, about the debt demanding its pound of flesh every single month, regardless of circumstances. And Jake decided he'd rather be poor and free than comfortable and enslaved to payments, even if it meant everyone thought he was a fool. "Let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever voluntarily made yourself poor to escape something worse? Have you ever chosen the harder path because you knew the easier path led to disaster?" Drop a comment, because Jake Henderson chose poverty and freedom over comfort and debt, and it changed his entire life. That first winter, Jake lived in his father's house with the heat turned down to 60 degrees to save money on propane. The house felt empty. His father's coffee cup still sat on the counter where he'd left it that last morning, his boots by the door, his coat on the hook. Jake couldn't bring himself to move any of it. He ate rice and beans every single day. Rice and beans for breakfast with an egg if the chickens were laying. Rice and beans for lunch. Rice and beans for dinner. He'd bought a 50-pound bag of rice and a 50-pound bag of pinto beans for $37 total. That was his food budget for 2 months. He wore his father's old coats because he couldn't afford new ones. They were too big, worn at the elbows, smelled like diesel and earth. But they were warm, and they were free. He stopped driving to town unless absolutely necessary. Gasoline cost money. Every trip to town was 8 miles each way. That was 16 miles of fuel he could save by just staying home. He worked construction 3 days a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The foreman had been willing to give him that schedule so he could work the farm the other days. The construction job paid $9.50 an hour. 3 8-hour days was $228 a week before taxes, about $900 a month take-home. Every dollar, beyond food and utilities, went into a coffee can in the kitchen, literally. An old Folgers can with a plastic lid, his debt payment fund. He'd write the amount on a piece of masking tape and stick it to the can. Week 1, 147. Week 2, 289. Week 3, $431. Watching that number climb toward $947. The first payment was due April 15th, 1993. Jake had from December through mid-April to save enough to make it. 5 months to save $947 while also eating and keeping the lights on. He made budgets on notebook paper, tracked every penny. Construction income per month, $900 propane, minimal use, $45 electricity, $38 phone, had to keep it for work calls, $23 food, rice, beans, eggs, $18 gasoline for truck, $40 total expenses, $164 money available for payment fund, $736 per month times 5 months, $3,680 minus one payment, $947 left over for spring farming expenses, $2,133. The math worked. Barely. But it worked. In his spare time, he worked on the Farmall. The tractor ran, but barely. It smoked like a bonfire. It leaked oil from every seal. The hydraulics were so weak they could barely lift a plow. It needed work. Serious work. Jake spent his evenings in the unheated machine shed, bundled in 3 of his father's coats, his breath visible in the cold air, rebuilding that tractor. He didn't have money for a mechanic, didn't have money for new parts from a dealer. What he had was his father's old tools, a worn Farmall service manual he found in the shed, and memories of watching his dad and grandfather work on equipment when he was a kid. He pulled the engine on a Saturday in January. It took him all day working with a come-along and chain hoist his father had rigged up decades ago. The engine came out covered in decades of grease and grime. He tore it down on the shop floor. Pistons worn, rings shot, bearings showing damage, valves barely seating. The engine needed a complete rebuild. New parts from a dealer would cost $800 minimum. Money Jake didn't have. Money that needed to go to the debt payment. So he got creative. He found a machine shop in the next county that had used Farmall parts, bought used pistons for $30, used rings for $12, used bearings for $8. He cleaned everything with solvent, filed and fitted everything by hand, checked clearances with feeler gauges, did the work his grandfather had taught his father and his father had taught him. Total parts cost $93. He rebuilt the carburetor with a kit he mail-ordered for $16. Fixed the hydraulic pump with seals that cost $11. Went through the transmission and replaced the clutch with parts he found at a salvage yard for $40. By March of 1993, Jake had $160 invested in parts and probably 200 hours invested in labor. And the Farmall was running better than it had in 20 years. The engine started on the first crank, settled into a smooth, steady idle. No smoke, no leaks. The hydraulics lifted a fully loaded plow like it weighed nothing. Jake sat on that tractor on a Sunday afternoon in late March, with the machine shed doors open and weak spring sunlight coming through, and felt something he hadn't felt since his father died. Hope. Maybe this could actually work. Maybe he could actually do this. And Jake was ready to farm. He had 240 acres, no equipment except one tractor and some salvaged implements, no money except what was in the coffee can, and a $16,000 debt that demanded $947 per month, starting in 3 weeks. Most people would have said it was impossible. Jake didn't care what most people would say. Farming with a 40-year-old tractor and almost no implements required creativity Jake didn't know he had. He couldn't afford to buy a plow, so he took the rusty old 3-bottom that had been rotting behind the shed and spent 2 full weeks rebuilding it. The moldboards were pitted with rust. The coulters were dull and bent. The hitch was seized solid. Jake sandblasted the rust off the moldboards, sharpened the coulters with an angle grinder, soaked the hitch in penetrating oil for 3 days, then heated it with a torch and beat it free with a sledgehammer. When he was done, the plow wouldn't win any beauty contests, but it would cut furrows, and that's all that mattered. He couldn't afford a planter, so he made a deal with his neighbor, old Bill Morrison. Bill would loan Jake his 4-row planter in exchange for Jake helping with Bill's wheat harvest later that summer. No money changed hands, just labor for equipment, the way farming used to work before everything became a transaction. He couldn't afford a sprayer, so he didn't spray. Just worked the ground well, planted good seed, and hoped for the best. No herbicides, no insecticides, just dirt and seed and sun and rain and hope. He couldn't afford a combine, so he arranged with a custom harvester named Rick Patterson to cut his crop in exchange for 20% of the grain. It hurt to give up that much, but it was better than trying to harvest by hand. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, it wasn't what any modern farmer would call a viable operation, but it worked. That first spring, Jake planted all 240 acres in corn. He started the first week of April and didn't finish until the second week of May. A modern farmer with a modern tractor and a 12-row planter could have done it in 3 days. It took Jake 5 weeks, but he got it done. The Farmall pulled slowly, 3 miles per hour with the plow, 4 with the planter, but it pulled steady. What took a modern tractor 2 days took Jake a week. But acre by acre, row by row, the field went in. He worked from dawn until dark, started at sunrise, worked until he couldn't see the rows anymore. Came home, ate rice and beans, fell into bed, woke up and did it again. There were setbacks. A hydraulic line burst on the planter and he lost half a day rigging a repair. A thunderstorm came through and turned the field into mud, forcing him to wait 3 days for it to dry. The Farmall threw a fan belt, and he had to drive to town to buy a replacement, eating into his precious cash reserve. But he kept going. By June, the corn was up, tiny green shoots in long, straight rows. Jake walked his fields in the evenings after work, checking the stand, looking for problems. The corn looked good, better than good. The ground he'd worked so carefully without chemicals, without rushing, was producing strong, healthy plants. He lived on $5 a day, literally. Rice, beans, eggs from 6 chickens he'd started keeping behind the house. He didn't go to town unless absolutely necessary. Didn't buy anything that wasn't critical for survival or farming. Every construction paycheck, minus his tiny living expenses, went into the coffee can. By the end of April, he'd saved $1,147. He made his first debt payment of $947 at the bank on the 15th, walked in with cash, counted it out on the counter. The teller looked at him strangely. Most people paid by check or automatic deduction, but took the money and gave him a receipt. Jake walked out of that bank with $100 in his pocket and a receipt showing he'd made his first payment. 1 down, 59 to go. Then he started saving again. June payment, $947. Made it with $43 to spare. He'd worked extra hours on a construction project that paid time and a half. August payment, $947. Made it with $11 left over. That month had been tight. The truck needed a new battery that cost $63. Had to come out of the payment fund. He'd made it, but barely. The math was brutal. He was earning about $1,500 a month from construction, living on $300. That left $1,200 for the payment, which meant he was making it by a couple $100 each month. No room for error. No room for emergencies, no room for life, but he was making it. Through the summer, Jake watched his corn grow, waist high by the 4th of July, shoulder high by August 1st, tasseling in late August, looking strong and healthy. The best crop his father's ground had produced in years, and Jake had done it with no chemicals, no modern equipment, just hard work and good farming. And then October came, and he harvested his first crop. The waiting was the hardest part. Watching the corn mature, watching the kernels dent and harden, checking moisture every day with a handheld tester, waiting for it to drop below 15% so it was safe to harvest. Finally, in mid-October, Rick Patterson showed up with his combine. Big, modern machine, could cut 8 rows at a time. Jake rode in the cab with him, watching his corn disappear into the combine header, stalks pulled in, ears stripped off, kernels shelled and augured into the grain tank, while the cobs and stalks got spit out the back. It took 3 days to cut all 240 acres. Jake watched every minute, watched his year's work, his hope, his survival turn into grain. When it was done, Jake had 28,000 bushels of corn in the grain bin. At October 1993 prices, $2.40 per bushel, that was worth $67,200 gross. Minus Rick Patterson's 20% cut for custom harvesting. $53,760 net. Jake stood there looking at that number on paper, and his knees almost buckled. His expenses for the entire year, seed, fuel, equipment repairs, everything, totaled about $12,000. His construction income for the year was about $18,000. His total income from both sources, $71,760. His living expenses for the year, $3,600. He'd actually managed to live on about $10 a day instead of $5, once the chickens got producing and he'd started eating a little better. His debt payments for the year, $11,364, 12 payments of $947. After all expenses and all payments, Jake had $56,796 left over. He sat at his father's old kitchen table with a calculator and ran the numbers 3 times to make sure he wasn't making a mistake. He wasn't. In 1 year, farming with a 40-year-old tractor and living on almost nothing, he'd earned enough to pay off the entire debt with $30,000 to spare. The remaining balance on his loans, after 12 months of payments, was about $12,000. Jake could write a check right now, pay it all off, be completely debt-free by tomorrow morning. His hand actually reached for his checkbook, then stopped. He remembered what his father had written, about living free of debt, about remembering what it felt like to be trapped. And Jake made a decision that everyone would think was crazy. He wasn't going to pay it off. Not yet. Now I want to hear from you. If you just earned enough money to pay off all your debt in one payment, would you do it? Or would you stick to the original plan and keep making payments to learn the lesson? Leave a comment, because Jake's choice here defined everything that came after. Jake kept making his monthly payments, $947, every month, like clockwork, on the 15th, in cash. Walking into that bank and counting out the money on the counter. The tellers got to know him, started calling him Cash Jake. He'd smile and count out his bills and take his receipt and leave. But he took that $56,000 surplus from his first harvest and did something strategic. There was a 40-acre parcel adjacent to his property. Old man Henriksen had been trying to sell it for 2 years. It wasn't prime ground, a little sandy, a creek running through one corner that sometimes flooded, but it was workable. And Henriksen was tired of waiting for a buyer. He'd been asking $32,000. Jake offered $25,000 cash, told Henriksen he could close in a week if the price was right. Henriksen accepted that afternoon. Just like that, Jake went from 240 acres to 280 acres, all paid for. No debt on the new ground, no mortgage, no lien, free and clear. He used another $8,000 to buy more equipment at auctions and estate sales. A grain drill for $800, a disc harrow for $600, a grain wagon for $400, all old, all needing work, all paid for in cash. And he kept the rest, about $23,000, in the bank. Emergency fund, safety net. Year 2, 1994, Jake planted 280 acres. Half corn, half soybeans. Crop rotation. The Farmall pulled everything. Jake was getting better at working with old equipment, learning to be efficient despite the limitations. That year's harvest netted $61,000 after expenses. The debt was down under $8,000 now. Jake bought another 30 acres from a widow for $28,000 cash. Total ground, 310 acres. Year 3, 1995. Jake was starting to feel like this might actually work. The operation was growing, the debt was shrinking. The Farmall, now 42 years old, was still running strong after another winter of meticulous maintenance. Neighbors who'd laughed 3 years ago were now asking questions. "How are you doing this?" The answer was always the same. No payments meant every dollar stayed in the operation. Year 4, 1996, brought the first real test. Drought hit that summer. Not catastrophic, but enough to hurt. Yields dropped 30%. Jake's harvest netted only $38,000 instead of the $60 he'd been averaging, but he still made every payment, still covered his expenses, because the debt service was manageable. If he'd been carrying the $50,000 his father had owed, that drought would have destroyed him. Instead, he survived it. Year 5, 1997. Jake made his final debt payment in October, 60 months after his father died. Exactly what the original payment schedule called for. The debt was gone, but Jake had also bought an additional 90 acres with cash, had accumulated 6 pieces of paid-off equipment, had saved $30,000 in the bank, and he'd done it all with a tractor his father bought for $300 in 1967. The day Jake made his final payment, he drove to the bank in person, handed the teller a check for $947. "This is my last one," he said. The teller looked it up. "Congratulations, Mr. Henderson. You're paid in full." Jake walked out of that bank and sat in his truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Just sat there, feeling what it felt like to owe nothing. Then he drove home, walked out to the machine shed and looked at the Farmall Super M. The tractor was 44 years old. It had farmed every acre Jake owned for 5 straight years. It had pulled every implement, done every job, never quit, never failed when it mattered. It was beat up, worn out, overdue for another rebuild. It was also the reason Jake still had his farm. Jake Henderson is 57 years old now, still farming. The operation has grown to 500 acres. He runs newer equipment now, tractors from the 90s and early 2000s, all bought used, all paid for in cash. But the 1953 Farmall Super M still sits in his machine shed, not for working anymore, for remembering. Jake takes his kids out there sometimes, shows them the tractor, tells them the story about their grandfather who died owing $50,000. About the letter that changed everything, about the choice to sell all the modern equipment and farm with a tractor nobody wanted, about living on $5 a day, about making payments every single month while building something on the side. This tractor, he tells them, cost your great-grandfather $300 in 1967. Your grandfather used it to farm for 20 years, then made the mistake of thinking he needed something better. When he died, he owed $50,000 on equipment that got repossessed or sold. I inherited that debt, and I used this tractor, this $300 tractor, to pay it all off in 5 years while buying 90 more acres with cash. Remember that. When someone tries to sell you something on credit, when someone says you need the newest and best to succeed, when someone tells you that old equipment can't compete. This tractor paid off $50,000 in debt and bought 90 acres of land, all because it didn't have a payment attached to it. Dee, his daughter, who's 16, always asks the same question. "Dad, why didn't you just pay off all the debt at once after that first big harvest?" And Jake always gives the same answer. "Because I needed to feel what debt felt like. Needed to know what it meant to make that payment every single month for 5 years. Needed to understand why your grandfather wrote that letter warning me never to make his mistake. If I'd paid it off early, I would have missed the lesson. I needed to live in that trap for the full 5 years to make sure I never built another one. So let me leave you with this. Right now, someone's trying to convince you that you need to finance something, that everyone does it, that it's normal, that it's how you grow. But Jake Henderson proved something different. He proved that inheriting debt doesn't mean staying in debt, that old equipment isn't worthless just because it's old. That you can build wealth while making payments if you're willing to live like nobody else. The dad died owing $50,000 in equipment loans. The son paid it off in 5 years with a tractor his father bought for $300. Not because the tractor was special, but because it was free, because it didn't demand a payment every month, because it gave Jake the freedom to build instead of just survive. If this story changed how you think about debt, inheritance, and building wealth the hard way, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about people who escaped financial traps through discipline and old equipment. Second, drop a comment. If you inherited debt tomorrow, would you have the courage to do what Jake did? Third, share this with someone who's drowning in equipment payments. Someone who needs to know that there's a way out, even if it's hard. The lawyer said it was impossible. The neighbors said he was crazy. The bank said he'd fail. But Jake Henderson paid off $50,000 in 5 years with a 40-year-old tractor and $5 daily living expenses. Because sometimes the only way out is through, and sometimes the oldest equipment is the most valuable tool you have. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.